Talal, also with regard to domestic debt restructuring, so putting into perspective what Ravi said, there should be a domestic debt restructuring that takes place in the country based on the IMF recommendations. Now, if you don't do what the IMF has recommended, we won't get the second tranche. So that's the risk that we are facing as a country. So it's important that we stick to the recommendations and the guidelines provided by the IMF on paper, and that was tabled in Parliament by President Ranil Wickremesinghe. What is your take with regard to domestic debt restructuring?
So, first of all, thank you very much for having me on the show. First of all, regarding domestic debt restructuring, as Ravi said, it's going to be something that where you shouldn't go unless you have absolutely no other choice. Because the effects are very high. You know, the banking, about 40% of their assets are in government securities. So if there is any sort of this thing, it's going to affect not just the banking sector, but insurance, EPF, ETF, and others. So, but at the same time, we cannot move without doing it as well. So there has to be some sort of adjustment going on where we can finally balance it. That was also put in at the letter by the private creditors to the IMF before. So if you look at it, sort of like it's almost like half is external and half is domestic. But if you look at the payments for 2023, a very huge amount comes almost if we are going to keep paying the external and the domestic, about 75% of the payment would be for domestic in the year 2023. But interestingly, for 2024, domestic, the payments would come below the external because it's a lot to do with the amount of treasury bills that were issued last year. So it's going to be a sort of a tough thing to do, but at the same time, it's got to be done as well. But at the same time, like if I may take the liberty to talk a bit about the IMF program as well. You see, I just want to say this, but there is a lot of talk about criticizing the IMF. But people need to know that we are going to the IMF because we have absolutely no other alternative. You see, there was a previous speaker who was saying that, you know, when really pushed, what is the alternative? Go with a bilateral, you know, go and talk to China, go and talk to Japan or India, and, you know, sort out something, get their investments, get support from them. Like, for example, let's take, we avoid the IMF and go to China and try to talk in and this thing. You see, we still have to restructure our debt. And China does not have the authority or the good relationship with the others to do this. So the only authority that has the clout and the sort of, what can you say, the right or thing that is accepted by all countries is the IMF. So we are there because we have no other choice. And the second thing is there is also a criticism about the IMF pushing poverty or, you know, not being a friend of the poor. So there is a thing saying, you know, when it comes to social security net, the IMF says 0.7% of GDP should be spent on that. So that is something that the IMF takes into account, even taking into account inflation. So even if there is inflation, the rates would be adjusted because the 0.7 to GDP ratio has to be maintained when it comes to social security. So